So once again, a very good morning to the students of class 12, and today we will take up once again the short story To Build a Fire by Jack London. And today we will do the third part of the video on this very long short story. So here on your screen, once again, you can see the man and you can see the dog, and you can see how the man is desperately trying to build a fire, but ultimately he loses his life. So we will continue with where we had left off, that is from the end of page 41, and move on with the next 4 pages of this short story. So let's start. So students, we are at the end of page 41 where we had left off in our previous video. Now this man, he just finished his lunch and he wanted to go on, but of course the dog did not want to carry on, and the dog was quite surprised that this man had decided to carry on with his journey across the Yukon Valley region. Now the cold of 107 degrees below freezing point, that is the status of the cold right now. But the dog knew, the dog could understand, because its instincts told the dog, all its ancestry knew that it had inherited the knowledge. So it had this knowledge inbuilt. Out of instinct, the dog could understand, because all natural beings, especially animals, they have this instinct which tells them what is right and what they should do. And it knew that it was not good to walk abroad in such fearful cold. It was the time to lie snug in a hole in the snow and wait for a certain, or rather curtain, of cloud to be drawn across the face of outer space whence this cold came. So the instinct of the dog was telling it all these things. On the other hand, there was no keen intimacy between the dog and the man. You see, the dog actually did not belong to this man. The man was not the owner of this dog. The husky was naturally following a human being, because the dog had this feeling that if it follows, all dogs always try to be close to human beings, and that is exactly what this dog was also doing, because the dog knew that with the human being there was the possibility of food and warmth. The one was the toil slave of the other. So dogs are faithful animals, they are faithful to human beings, and they are the slaves of human beings. So they love to carry out orders given by their human masters. So that is something which dogs normally have in their very being, that they want to be with human beings and they want to carry out the tasks given to them by the humans. So the dog is said to be the toil slave of the other, and the only caresses it had ever received were the caresses of the whiplash and of harsh and menacing throat sounds that threatened the whiplash. So being a husky has been a very difficult life for this dog, because huskies in these cold regions of the world are used for pulling the sledge. And when they are attached to the sledge, whips are used to make them move ahead. So the dog is accustomed to whiplashes and also the throaty sounds made by the owners, threatening to give them more whiplashes if they did not obey. So this dog was accustomed to that kind of lifestyle. So the dog made no effort to communicate its apprehension to the man. It was not concerned in the welfare of the man. It was for its own sake that it yearned back toward the fire. But the man whistled and spoke to it with the sound of a whiplashes. And the dog swung in at the man's heels and followed after. So the dog had to obey. The man whistled to the dog, and the dog realized that the man was calling it, that the dog realized that it could not lie near the fire but had to follow the man because the man was on his way once again. The man took a chew of tobacco and proceeded to start a new amber beard. That means the more he chews tobacco, more amount of tobacco juice accumulates on his mustaches and more of crystallized amber beard is formed on his face. So that is what was happening. Also, his moist breath quickly powdered with white his mustache, eyebrows and lashes. So you saw in the beginning the picture where you could see the man with his beard covered with snow and ice. So that is what is being described here. There did not seem to be so many springs on the left fork of the Henderson, and for half an hour the man saw no signs of any. And then it happened. At a place where there were no signs, where the soft, unbroken snow seemed to advertise solidity beneath, the man broke through. It was not deep. He wet himself halfway to the knees, just like what had happened earlier to the dog. The man had forced the dog to go ahead, and then the dog broke through the ice layer and got all drenched in its paws. Now this time it has happened with the man, and there were no signs that could tell the man that there was danger lying ahead, and he continued walking till he went through the thin sheet of ice into the water below. It was a small puddle, no doubt. It was not deep, but the problem is the moment you wet yourself and pull yourself out of the hole, the water that soaks into your shoes and your socks and your trousers immediately freezes into ice. He wet himself halfway to the knees before he floundered out to the firm crust. So he somehow pulled himself out. He was angry and cursed his luck aloud. He had hoped to get into camp with the boys at 6 o'clock, and this would delay him an hour, for he would have to build a fire and dry out his footgear. This was imperative at that low temperature. He knew that much, and he turned aside to the bank, which he climbed. On top, tangled in the underbush about the trunks of several small spruce trees, was a high water deposit of dry firewood, sticks and twigs principally, but also larger portions of seasoned branches and fine dry last year's grasses. He threw down several large pieces on top of the snow. So what is he trying to do? He's trying to collect some firewood and some dry grass which had been brought down by the Yukon River during the summer season, and now because of the snow and ice freezing the river water, these are deposited at certain places. He has collected them and he is now making a heap out of them, and then he intends to ignite them to make a fire. Let's see if he is successful. Now, he threw down several large pieces on top of the snow. They served for a foundation and prevented the young flame from drowning itself in the snow. It otherwise would melt. The flame he got by touching a match to a small shred of birch bark. Birch is yet another kind of coniferous tree that he took from his pocket. So he took out a matchbox and he decided to strike a matchstick, and he decided to ignite this birch bark. This burned, and we are at the end of page 42, moving on to page 43. This burned even more readily than paper. Placing it on the foundation, he fed the young flame with wisps of dry grass and with the tiniest dry twigs. So when you make a fire, initially the flame is small, and then you go on adding more fuel to it in the form of little bits of maybe twigs and wood and things like that. So that is what he was trying to do. He did not, of course, have any paper with him. So he was using the dry grass and twigs and other such things, whatever he could collect, to increase the flame, to make the fire bigger. And underneath we know that he has created a foundation so that the fire should not be doused by the extreme cold snow which has covered the ground. He worked slowly and carefully, keenly aware of his danger. Gradually, as the flame grew stronger, he increased the size of the twigs with which he fed it. He squatted, meaning to say he sat down on his haunches near the fire, and he was trying to make the fire grow bigger and bigger so that there would be sufficient warmth for him to dry his boots, his moccasins, his socks, his trousers, his feet. Up to his waist, he had to dry up first, and then he had to wear them again, and he had to continue on his journey. So he squatted in the snow and pulling the twigs out from their entanglement in the brush and feeding directly to the flame. He knew there must be no failure. When it is 75 below zero, a man must not fail in his first attempt to build a fire. That is, if his feet are wet. If his feet are dry and he fails, he can run along the trail for half a mile and restore the circulation. So, in this situation, running is impossible because he is already wet up to his knees. So, he cannot run to bring back the circulation of blood in his legs. He has to dry his pants, his trousers, he has to dry his moccasins, his socks, and then only he can continue on his journey. But the circulation of wet and freezing feet cannot be restored by running when it is 75 below. Now the man is still thinking it is 75 below, but we know because the dog's instinct tells the dog that it's much colder than 75. It's more than 100 below freezing point. No matter how fast he runs, the wet feet will freeze the harder. At this the man knew. The old timer on Sulphur Creek had told him about it the previous fall, and now he was appreciating the advice. The old timer refers to an old man whom this man had met at a place called Sulphur Creek, and they were discussing how treacherous it can be, especially in winter, to cross the Yukon region. And he had then slighted it off, did not pay much attention to the words of advice of this old man, but now he was appreciating the advice. Already all sensation had gone out of his feet. To build the fire, he had been forced to remove his mittens, and the fingers had quickly gone numb. So we have already seen an illustration. He has removed the mittens. In the second video I had shown it to you. His mittens are lying next to him, next to the fire, and he is trying to build the fire. His pace of 4 miles an hour had kept his heart pumping blood to the surface of his body and to all the extremities, all the ends and corners of his body. So when you walk, it is a good exercise. It provides blood circulation in all the nooks and corners of your body. But now he is squatting in front of the fire, and here even wasting a few seconds without walking can cause your body to grow numb. And over and above, to make the matter worse, he was soaked up to the knee. His pace of 4 miles was gone. But the instant he stopped, the action of the pump eased down. What is that pump? The heart. The human heart is a pump. It keeps on pumping blood. And if you walk, the pump works very healthily and you have blood circulation all over your body. But now that is something which was not happening because of the fact that he had stopped walking and he was sitting down to build this fire. So this is another problem which has come up apart from being drenched. The cold of space smote. Smote means to hit. The unprotected tip of the planet, and he, being on that unprotected tip, received the full force of the blow. The blood of his body recoiled before it. The blood was alive, like the dog. And like the dog, it wanted to hide away and cover itself up from the fearful cold. So the blood flowing in his body was also wanting to hide, because the man had exposed himself to the extreme temperatures of cold, and his blood seemed to say within his body that it's time to protect itself, it's time to hide somewhere so that this extreme cold does not cause damage to it. So long as he walked 4 miles an hour, he pumped that blood willy-nilly to the surface, but now it ebbed away and sank down into the recesses of his body. The extremities were the first to feel its absence. His wet feet froze the faster, and his exposed fingers numbed the faster, though they had not yet begun to freeze. Nose and cheeks were already freezing, while the skin of all his body chilled as it lost its blood. So you can understand the situation of this man. In this extreme temperature, the moment you stop, many adverse things start happening to you because you are a human being, a living creature. But he was safe. Toes and nose and cheeks would be only touched by the frost, for the fire was beginning to burn with strength. We have finished with page 43, moving on to page 44. He was feeding it with twigs the size of his finger. In another minute, he would be able to feed it with branches the size of his wrist. He was feeding it with twigs the size of his finger. So initially, as I told you, when the fire is small, you put in smaller things so that they can burn easily, and then the bigger it grows, the more bigger can be the firewood that you add to it, and that is what he was doing. So in another minute, he would be able to feed it with branches the size of his wrist, and then he could remove his wet footgear, and while it dried, he could keep his naked feet warm by the fire, rubbing them at first, of course, with snow. So this was his plan. The fire was a success. He was safe. He remembered the advice of the old timer on Sulphur Creek and smiled. The old timer had been very serious in laying down the law that no man must travel alone in the Klondike after 50 below. So this old timer at Sulphur Creek had also advised him that in the Klondike region, which is a part of the Yukon Valley region, nobody should travel when the temperature falls below 50 degrees. Well, here he had had the accident, he was alone, and he had saved himself. So he was feeling very confident, overconfident. Okay, that old timer was telling me I should not be traveling alone. I have traveled alone, I had the accident, and I have saved myself also. I have made the fire. Now I'll be fine and I'll continue on my journey and I'll prove the old man wrong. This is what he is thinking. Those old timers were rather womanish. Some of them, he thought. So this is what he is thinking, because he is overconfident, but he is making a mistake. All a man had to do was to keep his head, meaning to say, keep your nerves strong and do things which are supposed to be done, and nothing is going to happen to you. You will be fine. This is what he is thinking. And he was all right. Any man who was a man could travel alone. But it was surprising the rapidity with which his cheeks and nose were freezing. And he had not thought his fingers could go lifeless in so short a time. Lifeless they were, for he could scarcely make them move together to grip a twig, and they seemed remote from his body and from him. So what was he feeling? He was trying to pick a twig maybe, but it seemed that his fingers are not obeying his command, or even if he is picking up a twig, he cannot feel the sensation that he has actually picked it up or is holding it. So there is a kind of, you can say, disconnection working between his fingers and his rest of his body. It's all because of the extreme cold. When he touched a twig, he had to look and see whether or not he had hold of it. The wires were pretty well down between him and his finger ends, meaning to say the wiring or the connection between his fingers and his rest of his body seemed to be disrupted, all of which counted for little. There was the fire, snapping and crackling and promising life with every dancing flame. He started to untie his moccasins, his shoes. They were coated with ice. The thick German socks were like sheets of iron halfway to the knees, and the moccasin strings were like rods of steel, all twisted and knotted as if by some conflagration. So the shoestrings have become kind of like wires because of the cold, so hard. Okay, for a moment he tugged with his numb fingers, then realizing the folly of it, he drew his sheath knife. But before he could cut the strings, it happened. It was his own fault, or rather his mistake. He should not have built the fire under the spruce tree. He should have built it in the open, but it had been easier to pull the twigs from the brush and drop them directly on the fire. Now, the tree under which he had done this carried a weight of snow on its boughs. No wind had blown for weeks, and each bough was fully freighted, means fully loaded. Each time he had pulled a twig, he had communicated a slight agitation, slight movement or vibration to the tree. An imperceptible, and we have finished with page 44, an imperceptible agitation, something which he did not notice. It was a faint movement when he had pulled a twig from the tree, so far as he was concerned, but an agitation sufficient to bring about the disaster. High up in the tree, one bough capsized its load of snow. This fell on the boughs beneath, capsizing them. This process continued, spreading out and involving the whole tree. It grew like an avalanche, and it descended without warning upon the man and the fire. And the fire was blotted out. Where it had burned was a mantle of fresh and disordered snow. Entire fire was covered with snow, doused with snow. The man was shocked. It was as though he had just heard his own sentence of death. For a moment he sat and stared at the spot where the fire had been. Then he grew very calm. Perhaps the old timer on Sulphur Creek was right. If he had only had a trail mate, if he had with him another companion making the same journey along the trail with him, he would have been in no danger now. The trail mate could have built the fire. Well, it was up to him to build the fire over again, and this second time there must be no failure. Even if he succeeded, he would most likely lose some toes. His feet must be badly frozen by now. So, the snow bite will actually cost him his toes. Blood circulation must have stopped already, and so the toes will die out and he will have to amputate them. And there would be some time before the second fire was ready. Such were his thoughts. But he did not sit and think them. He was busy all the time. They were passing through his mind. He made a new foundation for a fire, this time in the open, where no treacherous tree could blot it out. Next, he gathered dry grasses and tiny twigs from the high water flotsam. He could not bring his fingers together to pull them out, but he was able to gather them by the handful. So what happens is, when you are not able to pull out individually and gathering all together, what happens is it mixes with the snow. In this way, he got many rotten twigs and bits of green moss that were undesirable. Now, the green moss and the rotten twigs will not burn. And so, this is going to become another new problem for him. But it was the best he could do. He worked methodically, even collecting an armful of the larger branches to be used later when the fire gathered strength. And all the while the dog sat and watched him, a certain yearning, wistfulness in its eyes. For it looked upon him as the fire provider, and the fire was slow in coming. When all was ready, the man reached in his pocket for a second piece of birch bark. He knew the bark was there, and though he could not feel it with his fingers, he could hear its crisp rustling as he fumbled for it. Try as he would, he could not clutch hold of it. And all the time in his consciousness, we have finished with page 45, was the knowledge that each instant his feet were freezing. This thought tended to put him in panic, but he fought against it and kept calm. He pulled on his mittens with his teeth and threshed his arms back and forth, beating his hands with all his might against his sides. So once again he's trying to do something which he has done before, and he's trying to regain circulation in his fingers, because he had removed his mittens and now he wants the circulation in his fingers to be back so that he can have sensation in his fingers. He did this sitting down, and he stood up to do it, and all the while the dog sat in the snow, its wolf brush of a tail curled around warmly over its 4 feet. Its sharp wolf ears pricked forward intently as it watched the man. The dog is watching the activities of the man. And the man, as he beat and threshed with his arms and hands, felt a great surge of envy as he regarded the creature. Creature here means the dog. That was warm and secure in its natural covering. The husky has a very thick fur coat on its body. The husky is built to face the elements in that way. So it's a God-gifted, it's a natural thing for the husky. It does not feel cold in the cold because of its protective layer of fur. So the man started feeling jealous. So we can see how man is vulnerable to the threats of the elements in comparison to animals. Animals have natural protection which human beings do not have. After a time, he was aware of the first faraway signals of sensation in his beaten fingers. The faint tingling grew stronger till it evolved into a stinging ache that was excruciating. Terrible pain in his fingers as the sensation started coming back, as he was beating his hands, his fingers against his body. He could feel the tingling pain in his fingers, but which the man hailed with satisfaction. So even if his fingers were paining, at least he was happy that sensation was back. Otherwise, he would be forced to lose his fingers also. He stripped the mitten from his right hand and fetched forth the birch bark. The exposed fingers were quickly going numb again. Next, he brought out his bunch of sulphur matches, but the tremendous cold had already driven the life out of his fingers. In his effort to separate one match from the others, the whole bunch fell in the snow. So just see how nemesis, how his fate, how his luck is not favoring him. All the matchsticks have fallen upon the snow. So he tried to pick it out of the snow but failed. The dead fingers could neither touch nor clutch. He was very careful. He drove the thought of his freezing feet and nose and cheeks out of his mind, devoting his whole soul to the matches. He watched, using the sense of vision in place of that of touch, and when he saw his fingers on each side the bunch, he closed them. That is, he willed to close them, for the wires were down. What wires? Connecting wires, as if they were wires connecting his fingers with the rest of his body, his nerves actually. So he tried to close them by seeing. He cannot feel with his fingers, so by seeing he is trying to clasp or hold onto the matchstick lying on the snow. And the fingers did not obey. He pulled the mitten on the right hand and beat it fiercely against his knee. Then with both mittened hands, he scooped the bunch of matches along with much snow into his lap. Yet he was no better off. Now when you pick up matchsticks lying in the snow together with the snow, what can you expect? They will become damp and they will not work. The spark will not be produced and the match would not ignite. After some manipulation, he managed to get the bunch between the heels of his mittened hands. In this fashion, he carried it to his mouth. The ice crackled and snapped when, by a violent effort, he opened his mouth. You remember that his mouth is already covered with deposits of ice because of the moisture that he is breathing out. He drew the lower jaw in, curled the upper lip out of the way, and scraped. We have come to the end of page 46. And scraped the bunch with his upper teeth in order to separate a match. He succeeded in getting one, which he dropped on his lap. He was no better off. He could not pick it up. Then he devised a way. He picked it up in his teeth and scratched it on his leg. 20 times he scratched before he succeeded in lighting it. As it flamed, he held it with his teeth to the birch bark, but the burning brimstone went up his nostrils and into his lungs, causing him to cough spasmodically. What is he trying to do? He's trying to strike a match using his mouth because his fingers are not working. And the match is ignited, but the fumes of the match, the smoke with the fire, is going into his nostrils, and that is nauseating, that is suffocating. The match fell into the snow and went out. The old timer on Sulphur Creek was right, he thought, in the moment of controlled despair that ensued, that started from there. After 50 below, a man should travel with a partner. He beat his hands, but failed in exciting any sensation. Suddenly he bared both hands. Removing the mittens with his teeth, he caught the whole bunch between the heels of his hands, the entire bunch of matchsticks. His arm muscles, not being frozen, enabled him to press the hand heels tightly against the matches. Then he scratched the bunch along his leg. It flared into flame. Now this is the scene which you saw in the beginning of today's video and the previous video. An entire bunch of matchsticks burning and the man freezing and the matchstick burning right before his face, and the husky sitting alongside is watching him. So that is actually what is happening here now. So it flared into flame, 70 sulfur matches at once. There was no wind to blow them out. He kept his head to one side to escape the strangling fumes, and he held the blazing bunch on the birch bark. As he so held it, he became aware of sensation in his hand. His flesh was burning. His flesh was burning because of the big flame that he had produced. He could smell it. Deep down below the surface, he could feel it. The sensation developed into pain that grew acute, and still he endured it, holding the flame of the matches clumsily to the bark that would not light readily because his own burning hands were in the way, absorbing most of the flame. So instead of the bark burning, his hand was burning. At last, when he could endure no more, he jerked his hands apart. The blazing matches fell sizzling into the snow, but the birch bark was alight. He began laying dry grasses and the tiniest twigs on the flame. He could not pick and choose, for he had to lift the fuel between the heels of his hands. Small pieces of rotten wood and green moss clung to the twigs, and he bit them off as well as he could with his teeth. His fingers are not working, so he's using his mouth to remove the impurities, the green moss and other such things which would not burn. He cherished the flame carefully and awkwardly. It meant life. It must not perish. The flame must not die out. The withdrawal of blood from the surface of his body now made him begin to shiver. So his blood was already drawn from his body because of the cold, and he grew more awkward. So we will stop here for the day. We have come to the end of page 47. We will continue from this last line of page 47 in our next video. So I hope I have been able to make you understand so far. Please watch the video again if you have any doubt with any of the lines or portions. Thank you so much.